AI, modern work, security.
We'll unravel it for you.
Hey everybody, welcome to Technically Unraveled. I am Kristen Fehrenbach, the Senior Director of Microsoft Go-to-Market here at PAX 8. Thanks so much for tuning in. We've got some pretty cool stuff coming your way, so you're going to want to like, share, and subscribe, because not only do you have Technically Unraveled, but you also have 2 other shows from PAX 8 Live. So please make sure you do that. But, before you get started today, you might have noticed there's somebody else in our little opening, right? But I'm super, super excited. We are going to announce the official new co-host of Technically Unraveled, David Powell. Welcome on.
Hey, Kristen. Looking forward to it. This could be a good time together.
I love it. I'm glad that we have talked you in. We've reined you in to Technically Unraveled. I think overall, this is going to be a really cool little duo because we've worked together.
Yeah. We've done some live shows, which was amazing. And I'm glad that we have great insurance because I'm going to need labrum surgery from where you were twisting my arm to do this. And fortunately, we have a very reasonable copay and some great physicians. And so I'll be able to get that handled. But no, I mean, you and I have done a bunch of this stuff together, and it's been a blast working with you. And I think that we're going to have a good time doing this together as well.
I love it. You know what? I think we got a short little video that recaps our whole relationship. Let's check it out.
Oh, no.
Roll Tide Roll.
Best use of Copilot? More me time at the spa.
I sure could go for a Diet Dew right about now. Feeling a little too mellow.
I wonder if my boss would let me expense some Copilot ink. I really dig the colors.
Wake up! It's time for Beyond Live.
We've got to go.
We're going to need new outfits. I think we're wearing the same thing in the all of the walls.
We're very on brand, Kristen. Very on brand.
I love it. I love it. So, as we go forward in Technically Unraveled, I'm super excited. We're going to cover AI, modern work, cybersecurity. So, from my side, as always, you could still expect Microsoft to be covered from programs, new changes, SKUs, what's coming down the pipeline. David, tell us what you're going to be covering on Technically Unraveled.
Well, it appears that my segment's going to be sponsored by Peter Millar and Diet Mountain Dew, but we'll be talking about cybersecurity when I'm on and other things that just interest me. I think in general, there's plenty of interesting topics out there that are kind of either security adjacent or tech adjacent. And those are some of the stuff that I'm going to be covering when I'm on.
I like it. So for today, we're going to be talking modern work and AI. How do we enhance performance? I'm really excited about this session because anything AI kind of gets me going. So David, who's our guest today?
So our guest today is a guy named Mike Perrone, and he is COO of a company called Prodoscore. And there was a time period where we had exited a business, and I needed to sit out a non-compete for a little while. And so I went out and worked at Prodoscore, which does employee productivity insights, which is like a super interesting thing. So it's one of those things where I think all of us have certain guesstimates and feels about, is being in office or out of office more productive. And just this past week, Amazon announced return to work. So it's been in the news a lot, this particular topic. But I guess the question is like, are our instincts correct on this, or what does the data say? So who has the data? Mike Perrone, COO of Prodoscore. Mike, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so nice to see you both. So Mike Perrone, CEO of Prodoscore, been with the company since inception for about 5 years. We're a productivity intelligence solution, which brings out critical insights on how people work. So it allows you to put programs in place and understand things to put them in a good spot within the organization and put them in a good spot to excel. So really excited to to kind of share some of the data with you today. And yeah, you're right. Big news from Amazon, bringing everyone back, and excited to kind of walk you through what the data shows.
Yeah. So full transparency, I'm a remote worker. I've been remote now for like 8 or 9 years. I was remote before remote was cool. Kristen is a remote worker, primarily though, is because we don't want her in the office. There's a difference,
It's understandable.
around that. And Mike is a remote worker. So I think, I know I feel really productive being a remote employee, but Mike, what does the data say when you look at kind of this remote versus on-site in office versus hybrid where it's some in office and some remote? Like what does the data show us on that?
Yeah, so the insights from we've got a slide we can share here. This study was actually done across the platform, looking at the productivity of an entire year. And so what's fascinating is you kind of see the ebbs and flows through through the calendar year. And here we're looking at that 8% more productivity from employees that are in a hybrid scenario than in a remote scenario. So we have the ability with, whether it's badge scanning or picking up when they're in the office based on their IP address through the Microsoft ecosystem, we can actually truly gauge, when David's in his hybrid schedule, when he's at the office, what kind of productivity he has, and then when he's remote. And it's fascinating to look at it from this side, as well as it is the person, David. So, what a lot of the time we see is that someone that is a high productivity employee, when they're in the office, they usually maintain that productivity when they go remote. I think where we see some of the challenges are when they're maybe not as productive in the office and you have, a hybrid schedule for that individual. They seem to drop a little bit more than your average and your above.
Gotcha. So basically, if you're a good employee, it doesn't matter where you are. And if you're kind of struggling with productivity, you should be in the office is where your productivity is going to be best. And if companies are looking for the most productive option, hybrid seems to be the right answer for that. Almost a 10% bump.
Yeah, and I think that's because you're offering that flexibility from the culture perspective for that organization. It's fascinating. We have one client that actually built a telecommute policy around Prodoscore, right? So what's fascinating there is it's more of an opt-in to work from a remote perspective. However, when you opt in, we have the Prodoscore data available, and over 90% of those employees elected in. So in that scenario, it's you can have my data, you can see my data. It's just business data, from predominantly your Office 365. But it's fascinating that the end user, the employee, chooses that. Yes, David, take a look at my data. I'm a hard worker remote. I'm a hard worker when I'm in the office, and, allow me flexibility.
Yeah.
Sure.
So,
And I mean, think about
go
it
ahead.
though, because you've got all these remote employees. So instead of saying, hey, you know what, PAX8 headquarters, Denver, you've got to be in the Denver area. We've opened it up and said, wherever. I'm in Houston, right? And so I think it also gives the flexibility for people to say, hey, you know what, we want to hire the right person no matter where they're at as well. So I think that can also really play into the productivity because now you've got the right individuals.
Yep.
Absolutely. That, and for certain roles, I've seen some of our companies hire remote in certain cost centers, right? Hiring employees to do a certain role. Maybe you can find more talent or at a lower cost outside of, let's say, Los Angeles or San Francisco, where the costs are higher, but still get that same feel that you're getting the same productivity levels.
Mike, I'm a car guy, as you know, and in the 90s when the Nissan 300ZX came out, Nissan ran an ad and it said there are sports cars and there are sports cars. It said ours is the one without the quotes, right? And you hear AI thrown around so much is right now you really kind of like AI and like AI, right? And so everybody's wanting to bolt that on, and it seems like all cool and fun. But Copilot, everyone here at PAX8 has Copilot, and it's a very effective tool. In fact, we're really trying to figure out how we can automate Kristen's job and just let AI do it so we don't have to have her around at all. Love you, Kristen. And
Easy.
but I think the tendency sometimes would be like, oh, well, maybe like lazy people are using AI to kind of like shortcut some things or whatever. What does the data say around AI as a productivity tool, and does that enhance performance and efficiency?
Yeah, so this was one of the studies that our lead data scientist picked up. He wanted to understand. So we understand how people use the different CRMs in the Office suite, the phone systems and tools like Microsoft Teams and calls and chats. And so what he wanted to understand, since we had all of that data, we also have the ability to kind of measure Copilot's data, right? From a perspective of that end user utilizing those solutions throughout the day. And the data was fascinating, because in my head, I was thinking before he started the study that, oh, you're going to be using tools like Copilot to, it'll make you do work more efficient and quicker. And so you might have lower scores because you're not doing as much activity, where in Verse, we're actually seeing, up to 21% more higher, and they're working longer days, the folks that are using those tools. And so I started to think about it. And so I think of myself, like, when I have a project I've got to do, or I've got to build a deck or a board deck, and, having the ability to use Copilot to just get things on paper to start that project, it seems I'm able to accomplish more tasks quicker, taking that approach, versus maybe I procrastinate starting with a blank slate. So I think those are kind of the things that we're seeing, is that people are using AI tools like Copilot, and it's actually allowing them to produce more from an outcome perspective, as well as it's driving higher activity levels.
That's pretty fascinating to me, particularly the working 90 more minutes, is like,
Right.
to your point, I would have thought that they would have used Copilot to shrink the time it took to do the same volume of work. But what you're saying is they're more effective and they're actually working more. And that's real talk, that's very counterintuitive to me. And it's cool that the data shows that.
Yeah, I think it ties to, like you'll also see they spend more time in other tools too. So I think there's a correlation to, these early adopters of Copilot are the ones that early adopt a lot of the technology that companies are offering within their organization. So they kind of go hand in hand with each other.
So they're just embracing the tooling overall better to some degree.
That's
Correct.
exactly it. And so, like, everybody at Pax8, we all have Copilot licenses, and it changes the way you work. So, I mean, at first I was like, okay, I guess I'll just go recap this Teams meeting. Like, that's cool. Like, okay, excellent. Like, some action items. Cool. Everything's good. But if you've had more than, a 3-minute conversation with me, you can tell sometimes my ADHD will take over, and I'm like, ding, 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 and my brain just goes wild, right? So sometimes just giving me somewhere to start. And because if I open up a PowerPoint, it's blank. I'm just going to sit there. I'm like, oh, all right, well, I'm going to come back to that later. But I think that Copilot's allowed me to say, hey, you know what? Like, okay, there's at least somewhere for me to start, and then I can start ripping and replacing. And it just kind of is that inspiration. So is that kind of what you're seeing too?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, that's how it's an amazing tool. You start early on with it, and then as you grow, it just, it becomes more and more a part of your day.
The last thing, Mike, is when I kind of think about like collaboration, they call these tools collaboration tools, and sometimes I feel like, is that really a good substitute for being in the office and getting on a dry erase board and all this kind of stuff? But I think that, again, our gut, because we kind of grew up that way, is that being in the office fosters more collaboration. But I think that this tooling has gotten so good that that's actually not the case. So what does the data show around like collaboration and, the impact on productivity and leadership around that?
Yeah, so we've done a lot of studies on this over the last year. When it comes to, the main industry term would be like organizational network analysis, is trying to understand, when you think of, let's say the Microsoft 365 suite, right? When you think of, Teams, calendar meetings that you collaborate with folks, Teams calls, Teams chat. There's so much data on these webs of interconnectivity within organizations. And you think now too, with the remote world, are your leaders still connecting with those employees that maybe are not still in an office? And some of the data is fascinating. This was one where a company provided us the end results. So we had quota attainment. So we knew these are specifically leaders managing sales teams. You see there's met and exceeded, and then there's below quota. And what's fascinating here, Prodoscore is calculated off of an activity component. So So you can see that their average score, the ones that did not hit their quota were 69. The one that met and exceeded were 71. And what's so fascinating is these leaders of like why they were successful and produced the end result is they collaborated more. You can see that the average number of collaborators for the managers that met and exceeded quota was 26 individuals. And then we have a collaboration score of combining chat and Teams calls and invites and synergies between them. They were a 460, the below were 131. And so it's just fascinating through these tools. You could see the collaboration component of the leaders is really what's driving the end result for those individuals, not as much about the activity side.
That's like super interesting. How does that play within like departments and things like that? I mean, that I think was performance against quota within a team. What about like cross departmental?
Yeah, this has been really fascinating. In this organizational network analysis, what we've been studying are these folks called like critical connectors, as well as leadership potential. And so leadership potential across all organizations is sometimes very difficult to kind of assess. And so how we've been using this tool with our clients is that we can see the people that are not leaders, right? So I can see that this person works in, let's just say, my customer support group. Yet this leader, everyone goes to them, right? They're this cog in the organization that everyone's driving data to, right? Asking for advice. They're these critical connectors, these knowledge workers, right? But they're not a leader, right? This is a great example of being able to find these connectors that maybe you should look to for promotion, or if you were downsizing your business, gosh, that's someone you could not lose because they're so crucial for the business. So when you think of Microsoft Teams and how they collaborate and how they synergize with each other, it's fascinating when you look at the data around how people socialize. This was one stat we saw which just kind of baffled me, that 61% of managers have not spoken to at least one of their individuals over chat over a week, which is kind of baffling from a frontline manager leadership perspective. And only 16% of the leaders that we had on there contacted all of their team members daily.
That is kind of crazy. The 61%
Baffling.
not talking to their people is
Not
crazy.
even one. It's a not even
Yeah.
one. Like if you've got a
That's
team of 10,
nuts.
you haven't sent a message saying, "Hey, good morning. How
No.
was your
Yeah.
weekend?" Like nothing.
Yeah. And Mike, I think one thing that was in office, if Kristen and I worked together, and I was like in a meeting with her, and I could see she looked a little bummed out. And maybe I walked past her cubicle, and I could see she's a little bummed out. So I asked her to go to lunch, and I'm like, "Hey, Kristen, is everything okay?" And she's like, "Dave, there's 4 open headcount on my team. I'm doing the work of 5 people. This is non-sustainable." In a remote world, you don't really get some of those cues that somebody is maybe considering leaving, or things aren't going quite as well, or is that kind of flight risk or whatever. I understand your data can point out maybe who is considering leaving or whatever kind of early, and you have some data on that. How do we think about that?
Yeah, because most of our clients are on Microsoft 365. We understand when people terminate the business. So we have this rich data around termination. So our data science team has been working on this for the last year of, can we predict, are there attributes that can predict attrition, right? And so what they settled on was it's about an 18-week period of analyzing data. We need about 18 weeks worth of data to be able to give you basically a prediction of a risk score of that individual over the next 6 to 9 weeks that they could potentially attrit. So it's fascinating there. And again, it's just and these are the people you don't want to lose, right? And I don't think there's anything worse in my career than a top sales professional or top employee walking in and you didn't even see it coming. And those are the things that we're trying to prevent, so people can get ahead of those conversations and alleviate, losing some of those folks for scenarios like you described.
That can
super
save the
interesting.
business so much money. Like if you're not having to replace these people, if they're just getting inundated, like they're kind of the circle, right, that everybody's coming to. imagine being able to save that person and say like, hey, you know what? I know you've got a lot going on. I know you might be feeling burnt out. What can I do to support you? Like just that small conversation can help retain that employee.
Oh, because replacement costs not only on the salary, but just lost productivity and getting somebody trained and up to speed on the systems and the tools.
Hiring.
Oh, it takes forever, and if you could have that early warning sign to see, based on the data, who is a flight risk, that's like super powerful.
Absolutely.
I think it becomes another like Prodoscore is not the data point, right? But it gives you another data point to analyze things, right? Especially if you're only looking at end results, if you're only looking at number of tickets closed or percent to quota, looking at other holistic data points really give you kind of an opportunity to see where an employee's at and what value they're bringing to the organization.
Yeah. All right. So, Mike, I know that when y'all get all this data, data surfaces all sorts of quirky, interesting things. Like, what is the most shocking piece of data that you guys have found combing through employee productivity insights?
Yeah, so when you think of all the customers and data points and employees that we've got on the platform, I think the one that jumped out at me the most was that the bottom 10% from a scoring perspective, the bottom 10% of their Proto scores actually only works on average about an hour and 30 minutes per day. That one,
Kristen right now is saying that seems like a lot to her, but I think for everyone else, I think for everyone else,
like, man, I got this in 30 minutes, guys. No problem.
Yeah. But I mean, Mike, that's kind of crazy.
Insane.
That is crazy, right?
Yeah, and early on, when we got this data point, David, I thought this would be the magic bullet, right? You go into an organization and go, hey, Mr. CEO, I can tell you the bottom 10% and who's on average working an hour and 30 minutes, because it's almost like clockwork. We traditionally see when we deploy our solution, we go back 90 days and we get scores right out of the gate. And those individuals usually fall, there's usually about 10% in that bucket. However, I started to learn that they kind of account for that, right? And where we can bring more value are kind of on the conversations that we talked about earlier of not losing the best people, right? And having kind of key indicators into those individuals to spot potential disengagement, who are those critical connectors, things like that. Because I thought that was the magic bullet. Like, I could save you 10% on your payroll right out of the gate. The ROI is there, but I quickly learned that they kind of account for that in the dollars already.
Well, that's kind of crazy, but I mean, it does make sense to some degree to where I guess you have baked into the model a certain amount of non-productivity. But at the end of the day, kind of to your previous point, is that I think they care more about how do we keep the good people than, rectifying this problem. Because I guess there's always going to be somebody at the bottom end of the performance, spectrum, right? Just kind of the law of averages to some degree.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Kristen, how many times have you only worked an hour and 30 minutes?
Saturdays.
Sundays.
I don't know.
I'm
still trying to wrap my head around this. I'm like, an hour and 38 minutes. Like, this is insane. And I mean, if we, I was just thinking about the graphic that we had up and, the managers only talking to their employees, not talking to them at all during the week. And then it was even interesting. One that wasn't even highlighted was the one at the bottom as the team chats. And the people who weren't, they were only like, 700? And then people who were really highly engaged were double. And so I think it's really honing in on like manager training, making sure that, hey, you know what, we're really taking care of these employees. There's just some like fundamental things that you can always make sure that, hey, you know what, these employees, they feel valued. They feel like they have a spot in the organization. And man, an hour and 38 minutes, like I don't even know how to prioritize what I would start doing first if I only had that long.
Yeah. And Mike, does the data show, are they knocking out like an hour and 38 minutes at the start of the day, then they're peace out? Or are they sprinkling the hour and 38 across the day?
Yeah, it's more sporadic. We've got a study coming out here shortly where it talks to exactly what you're describing, where we kind of know when they're available. We call it available work, right? So I know kind of when David checks in and when he checks out for the business, but then how active is he throughout that day, right? So we've got a study coming out that which will be fascinating because it actually shows the ones that check in and check out and are productive produce the better end result. Then let's say the person that started, I sent an email at 6 a.m. and at 9 p.m., but I'm sporadic throughout the day, right? You see actually better results from the people that check in, stay consistent throughout the day, from that, and then shut it down, right? So it's been fascinating to look at that from we call it work habits, and then looking at the work habits of an office employee versus a remote employee. That's when it's fascinating, right? Because you traditionally see with the office employee, they check in, they check out, they're kind of done. Where you see with the remote employee, it's much more earlier and later in the day driving that same type of activity, but there's more gaps within it, which kind of makes sense. I'm imagining if you think about your cadences when you're in an office or working remote for the day.
Yeah. Are y'all seeing data
I gotta
where
let
like
Winston
work?
out.
Yeah. Are you seeing data where work time bleeds into personal time a whole lot?
Not as much. No, I think it allows for flexibility in job satisfaction. I think, allowing the remote work. Like I said, you don't see mass differences between in office and remote productivity. If you are a good employee in the office, you're not going to see those huge dips. You really, what skews the number are the bottom productivity people in an office going remote really do weigh down that score of why you see that kind of 8% differential there between hybrid and remote.
Well, Kristen, Mike, Prodoscore is not a startup; they're early stage. And one of the jokes, I've been in startup culture a long time, and one of the jokes in startup culture is like if you're hiring somebody, I would say like, "Hey, Kristen, welcome on board. Here we only work half days. You get to pick which 12 hours." And so it's this idea, right? That it's like always on,
Yes.
it's a crazy culture. But Mike, I think this data is super cool. Number one, for a big Microsoft place like us, I think it shows that it's not just that we're throwing tools at the employee base, that there is true productivity gains from things like Teams and the immediate collaborative nature of that, the ability to use AI to make your work more effective as opposed to kind of enable the laziness, around that. And then, that whole kind of focus on, how do we identify high performers that are burning out or maybe a little frustrated that we can intervene, because more than identifying the slackers, we want to identify the key people, that we want to keep. So I think that all of us have probably pretty strong gut feelings on these things just because that's the way that we work. But it sure is interesting to see the data tell a story instead of gut feeling telling the story.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think where I'm seeing the biggest area and the biggest challenge in organizations is the frontline leaders, right? In having the data to see, who's legitimately, like, if you're not on Teams calls, you're not in calendar invites, you're not chatting your people, like, how are you going to be developing? And so it allows these executives to really dive into those frontline leaders and help coach them through this hybrid world, which is just different than being in the office every day.
Yeah. Well, everybody, thanks so much, Mike, for being on here. We appreciate the insights and all that stuff. And go Liverpool.
There you go.
Your Bulls not so good, but maybe the Bears can pull out a decent season for you in Chicago
Thanks,
this year. Mike, thanks for being on. We appreciate you.
Thank you.
Awesome. What a great show. David, our first co-host, official forever show down, not our first co-host one, because we've had lots of shows that we've done together. So big thank you for joining, and awesome find with Mike. That was some great data. So big thank you.